So today we want to finish what we did yesterday, and afterwards we will take a look at how we can import something like this from Illustrator and how we need to prepare things. And as the end result, we will have this. Whee! It doesn't look as fancy on that screen, it's fairly flat. But here, look, it looks nice. Anyway, first we'll finish up our example over here. So we already have most of the things in here. They're just small adjustments that we want to do. I will do it first, afterwards we do it together. If I hit the render button, I can see that I have two things that are bothering me. Thing number one, I don't really like that I have this edge here in the back. So that's kind of bothering me. It's just a small one, but it's there, and I don't want it to be there. The other thing is that I feel like it could look even softer. I feel like the shadows are just a little bit too dark. It's just a super minor detail, but I think it can look a little bit nicer. So let me first fix the issue here. The simplest solution is just to create a separate material for the floor. So again, I duplicate the white material by holding down Control and dragging it to the side. Let me call this one floor. I double click on it, and I will change the preview here to, I'm blind, there, plain. This has no effect on the material. This is really just the preview here. I will then go to my alpha, and as the alpha, I'll add a texture, which is a gradient. I click either on the button here or on the preview icon, and I will change the gradient to circular. I then drag the black to the right and the white to the left. The black should be at around 75% to make sure that it stays within this boundary, because if I drag it all the way to the outside, it will actually go from the center to the top right corner. So I can see here that I get some edges which I don't want. So at around 75%, we are usually safe within the boundaries. I'll then apply this material to the floor. So here's my plane, and I will just drag the material onto the old one to replace it. Already in Cinema, I can see in the preview a little bit what's happening here. And if I now hit the render button, I can see how I now get the feeling of this infinite floor, because it's just fading out and kind of merging with my background. Alright, next, I feel like my shadows could be a little bit softer. And to do that, I want to make sure that not only my lights do bounce from the floor, but also my sky is being bounced off the floor. Because as you might remember, when we enable GI, lights get the additional bounce, and skies get their first bounce. Right? Because skies they are not lights, so they only emit light because of GI. So we would need a secondary method of the GI if we want our skylight to also bounce one more. If I go to my render settings, I can go to global illumination, and here we have the secondary method, which then defines what our second bounce is. By default it's set to none, and in most cases we also don't need it. It looks fine the way it is. But in this case I do want it to be a little bit lighter, and we have 4 different options that we could take. Do not take this one or that one. This one you can take, and this one you could take. The Quasi Monte Carlo is usually still the best and the most accurate one, but using Quasi Monte Carlo as the secondary method will increase your render time quite dramatically. Yes?
Why is it called like this?
Probably because
Carlo is the best.
Quasi Monte Carlo was a guy, he invented this shadow. Like he found it in his
yeah, like for instance, all the reflections are called after the people who kind of made the mathematical equations for it. Like the Fongtag was actually, yeah, it's Chinese or something called Fong. And the reflection types are also all based upon the people who build the equations for that. So for instance, later on we'll take a look at reflectance, and we have, for instance, Beckman, Fong, and Ward, or there was another one, I'm not quite sure which one it was, which was also based on a name. GGX is something different, but
Would be a nice name though, GGX.
And I know this
Yeah.
guy also has his name there, Catmull from Pixar Animation, the guy who founded Pixar, but it's under the subdivision
yeah,
thing, Catmull something.
yeah,
did you
Catmull
find?
Clark.
Yeah,
What did you find?
Pixar.
He's the owner. Or he was maybe.
Yeah, he's the founder.
Yeah, and for subdivision surfaces, we do have the Catmull Clark
Yeah.
way that,
He
Yeah.
also worked with Cinema 4D.
These guys are like the guys who built the whole 3D modeling universe.
yeah, and the way that the subdivision surface works is the way that he invented it for Pixar. And that's why it's called like this. All right. So where were we? In this, we wanted the secondary method. So quasi-Monte Carlo is the most accurate method. However, it also takes the longest. For the primary method, we do want quasi-Monte Carlo, but for the secondary method, we can take something that calculates a little bit less accurate, but therefore faster. And that is the irradiance cache. These other things are just in here more for legacy purposes, but not really because you want to use them. So for the secondary method, either quasi-Monte Carlo or irradiance cache. All right. If I now hit the render button, I can see how I get this pre-pass, which is my irradiance cache. And then afterwards, it calculates the actual image. And I will just let this calculate in the background to show you what the difference is. So here, I don't want to save this. I only want a smaller version of this. Looks good. All right. So this will be the first image. Shouldn't take too long to render. And then afterwards, I will add the secondary method, so just so we can see how the shadows behave differently, and also how the render time increases. So right now, we will have a render time of around 30 seconds. No, even less. Oh, yeah. Ignore that. And now with the quasi-Monte Carlo, with the irradiance cache, this will take a little bit longer. Then there's one more thing that I want to add, which is a little bit of a vignette. And we can already have that rendered right in Cinema by giving a camera a couple of properties, or just one property. If I go over here, I can create a camera. The nice thing about a camera is that I can go inside of the camera by hitting this button here. When it's white, I'm inside of it. I can then define a camera angle, like this one here, or let me actually keep the one that I had earlier. I can go outside of the camera and move around to look at things from a different angle, and then I can just go back into the camera, and then I'm exactly at the same angle again. Also, with cameras, we do have a couple of other options. For instance, let me just create a second one, where I could say that I want a different focal length. For instance, here under the presets, I could take a tele, and now I can see how this looks like it's viewed at from much, much further away. Or I can take a wide angle, and now it's much more dramatic. Alright, so this is like the basics that we can change, the focal length here. Then, in the next tab, we have the option for a lens distortion. However, the lens distortion is only visible once we render it. Alright, the rendering is done. I can see that it took much, much longer to calculate. So here, 26 seconds, and now we have 1 minute and 36. Just because we added this secondary method. But if I compare the two, I can see how this just looks so much brighter and friendlier. You might think you could get to this with just a color correction, but it's just not the same. It's just a very small thing, but it makes a huge difference between looking just kind of too dark and looking nice and soft and way more realistic. So let me talk about this stuff that we get over here. Usually we render things out with transparency if we have a transparent background. Cinema detects our sky as a transparent background. So it usually thinks that when we use the sky, we don't want to render it out. We really want to use this just to light up something. So it will get rid of the sky and save our file as straight or unpremultiplied. We did not talk about these things yet, right? We also don't wanna. I'll talk about it in the After Effects class on Monday. Yeah, because it also applies to things you can do in After Effects.
Oh.
So it makes more sense to talk about it there. So the weird stuff that we see is just because of the unpremultiply method that is applied here. And I've told the program to render out a PNG and that the alpha should be straight, and when we tell it that, then it looks like this. If I don't tell it to be straight, just to show you the difference, let's choose here something else, like a TIFF, and that the alpha should not be straight. And I get rid of the secondary for now. And I render this again. I will render in, let's say, 24 seconds. And after it's rendered, we will have a pretty black background. Oh no, it doesn't show it here. Alright, but in theory we would have a black background. I'll show it to you on Monday. Essentially, there are just two different ways that transparency is interpreted by programs. I talk about it on Monday. Anyways, but you can see, as soon as I told it that it should not use a straight alpha, or if I tell it to not use an alpha at all, then we don't get these weird issues on the edges. Alright, now quickly for the vignette. If we go to the physical tab, we do have a couple of options here. We could, for instance, change the f-stop, which is only necessary if we have depth of field, which we don't have in this example. The shutter speed is only important when we render out with motion blur. The same applies to the shutter efficiency, so we don't really need to think about that. Then we have the lens distortion. Let me just take something extreme to show you what it does. And by the way, quadric and cubic are essentially the same. They just look mildly different. So for geeks, they might choose one or the other, but for us, it doesn't matter which one you choose, it's the same thing. So here you can see this is the before, and this is now the after. So it's like this.
What is the difference from the other one? There is one.
There is one. Let's just take a look.
Yeah, you said we won't see it. But what is the difference?
Well, it appears to be a little bit more extreme.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a little bit the way that the edges wrap around. It's just a little bit different from the way that the deformation works. But essentially, I don't see it really. It's just, I couldn't put my finger on it, so I don't care. Alright. Then down here we have the vignette intensity. If I set this to 100, then I can see how I get this super strong vignette. The offset defines, why is it so dark?
Maybe because of the screen.
The offset defines how far the center is away from the center. So by default, the center of the vignette is really in the center, and it goes to the border around here, so from here to here. And the offset just pushes the center outwards. So if I have my offset here set to 50%, and I now render, I can see how my vignette is just offset. And instead of starting in the center, it starts around here. So in comparison, no vignette with vignette and the offset, and no offset. Make sense?
Yep.
All right. So let's do this together. First, we want to fix our floor. For that, we will duplicate our white material by holding down Control and dragging it to the side. We can rename it so we know what it is. Double click on it and change the preview icon in the top left corner by right clicking on it and choosing Plane. Then we want to scroll down to the alpha and enable it. Then we go to the texture, click on the little play button, and choose Gradient. We open up the gradient and change the type from 2D hue to 2D circular. We move the black one to the right to around 75%. You can also give this a very exact value by opening up the options for the gradient here. And then with the bucket selected, you can type in a specific position. And then the white one all the way to the left.
When you were saying at the beginning, it was just turning on the file. Can you do it again? The material.
Turning on. I'll just come to you.
No.
Now we want to apply this to the floor if it's not applied already.
And it's also
So we-
applied to the sky, right?
No,
No. Ah, no.
just to the
yeah.
floor. So we drag it and just drop it onto the material tag that we already have to replace it. If you drag it too far to the side, let me just undo. If you drag it too far to the side or just onto the object, you can see how we have this material and then this one here. Because this has an alpha, it will just be like a second layer on top of the first material. So we will not get any transparency because this one here already tells the entire element to be opaque. So this one here would just be layered on top. But if we have no material first, then we do get the transparency that we want. So if we now hit the render button, we should not see any border in the back here. So far so good? Next, we want this vignette here. I will do the vignette first before we do the secondary method because the secondary method takes so long to render. Here we will create a new camera and we go inside of the camera by clicking that icon here. When it's white, we are inside of that camera and looking through it. Then we go to the physical tab, scroll down a bit, and there we have the vignette intensity, which I think we want to set to maybe 50%, maybe 25%, we'll see in a bit. The offset, I would just keep as is, at 0%. If you now hit the render button, it should look like this.
You should do it already, right?
Yeah.
You go to Did you change something else?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Just the vignette intensity. So far so good?
Yeah.
You can tell if there is there a
Yeah, me neither. Like, doesn't change anything.
The vignette?
Oh no. Oh, okay. You have to have the camera set.
Yeah. If you are not inside of the camera, you're not looking through it, and the default camera does not have a vignette. So you need to look through the camera by having this icon here enabled. And then you should clearly see a vignette. Alright. Next, we want the nicer lighting. For that, we go into our render settings, choose the global illumination tab, and change the secondary method to irradiance cache. If we now hit the render button, we should see how we get this pre-pass, which you cannot really see on the screen here, but on your screen you should see it a bit better. And then the actual render will start. It will be a lot slower than it was before, but it will just be a little bit brighter and softer and just look more realistic. So far so good?
Yep.
Alrighty. Now we just need to think about how we want to save this out.
Yeah.
To render this out in the end, I think we can do this together because there are not so many steps and we've done it in the past. Let's go to the output and double check that we have set the size that we want. So 1920 by 1080 is always a good place to start. Then underneath the save option, we want to make sure that as the format we choose PNG. I think we can also choose 16-bit. The gradients will just look a little bit softer. And since we don't have transparency here, because we already have our background rendered, we can just say that we don't want any alpha. Since we are not planning on rendering out masks for this, I think this already looks good the way it is. We also don't need to have a multipass, so we can disable it on the left here. Then it will also disappear here. Then we need to define where we want to save this file. So we click on the dot dot dot, maybe put it on the desktop, and call it bold. Next, we want to make sure that this renders at the best quality. So what I've realized is when I render this region here, for instance, by the way, what I'm using is the interactive render region, or actually it's called just the render region. So when I click and hold on this button, I can choose the render region. My cursor becomes this plus, and then I can just click and drag over an area, and then it will only render that area, which will obviously be a lot faster than rendering the entire image. So when I look closely, I can see that mostly it looks fine, but it does look a little bit grainy here in the shadowy areas. To get rid of that, I will go to the physical tab and change the sampling quality from low to medium. Again, do not choose high. High is really only necessary when we render something with depth of field and strong reflections. Otherwise, keep it at medium. It is usually good enough. Alrighty. Now we would be ready to render.
About the resolution, what you put usually 72 or 300 maybe, or 150? I don't
It
know.
doesn't matter at all because we are rendering
You're
out
not comparing
pixels.
Okay.
We're not rendering in centimeters. The resolution is only necessary if we have defined centimeters here, because the resolution says how many pixels per inch. But if we already say we want this many pixels, this value has no effect at all. So this is really only for print and when you define something in centimeters. Alrighty. Then I would say we can send this to the renderer, and this might take a little bit. So when we send this over, it will be a fairly large image. Here we will first get this pre-pass. It's fairly dark, so you don't really see it on the screen up there right now. Then we'll do the actual rendering, but this will take a couple of minutes. So while it's rendering, we can do other things. And we can just minimize this. Don't hit the X button, because if you hit the X button, it will ask you if you want to stop the image from calculating. You could say no, then it will still render in the background, and you can get it back by going to Window and opening up the picture viewer again. But I usually just minimize this window because I can easier get it back to see how far my rendering have come.
Sure.
While this is rendering, we can start already with the second project that we want to do. So down here we can already see that this will take super long. 2 minutes for just this one here. So yeah, this will take some time. Let's open up Illustrator. All right. Let's open up the file that you did not get today. It's on these sticks here. Then I will just firstly talk about the file. Cinema and Illustrator do kind of have a connection, but it's very, 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 very limited. It's like really just the most basic thing can be exchanged, which is a path. That's it. Cinema does not import colors. How could it? Cinema does not import strokes or patterns or art brushes or texts. Cinema only detects the raw paths that we have. So if I have something like this here, what I did is, this obviously is really just a simple path that I drew. The text I have outlined. Do you know how to outline text?
Oh, yeah.
Command-Shift-O, or you can go to Type and then somewhere here create outlines for the text. To create this extrusion here, I did not use a stroke because the stroke would not give me the result that I want. Let me just show you quickly. If I have a text and I put a stroke on it, I could expand the stroke from my object here. So I could go to Type and Object, and I could say that I want to expand this. I then get the object to say that I want to expand my fill, and why don't I? Well, let's see. I hit OK, and now I can see that I have two objects. One object, which is just my stroke. If I ungroup this one more time. No, it doesn't. Alright, so then I need to outline my text first. Command-Shift-O. And now I should be able to expand, fill in stroke. And now I would have, if I go inside here, the stroke as a separate element. But the issue here is that my stroke does not fill the background. And this might not really be what I'm looking for. I was really looking for something that is going actually behind it and fills it. So I could have the black text, or in the example here, I wanted the green text to really just lie on top of the white one without a hole in the back. I mean, in this example, I would not see the hole, but I would know that it's there, and it would kind of be bothering me. So what I did instead is I outlined the text, and then I went to, I always forget where it is. Oh no, it's under Object, Path, and then Offset Path. And here I could use a preview to see how much of an offset I would get. So maybe 5 pixels. And then I can take a look, and I can see, if I expand my group here, that I have each letter 2 times. one in the larger version and one in the smaller version. So I could select all the thicker versions, group them together, and then I have the thing that I was looking for. Kind of understood? All right. So,
I need to remember everything.
yeah, it's recorded. It is recorded, right? It is recorded. If we have things like this here, where I have this path. Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm boring.
No.
And I make this a little bit thicker. I might use a styled stroke here. So for instance, I might use something like this. Cinema does not understand this. What Cinema would import is just the path that I have without the stroke. So I would not be able to get this thing here with the different thicknesses. What I would then need to do for Cinema to understand it is expand the appearance. So here I will go to Object and say Expand Appearance. And that way I make sure that I actually have the actual outline of the stroke. And now Cinema understands this. The same applies to art brushes or whatever you use. Obviously, if you use anything with textures, so pixel information, that would not work. Alright. In here, we don't really need to organize anything, because Cinema will mess most of the things up anyways. We can create groups for the separate things that we have. We don't really need to rename them, because Cinema will also do whatever it wants. And I could still have, by the way, I had a reference image here. I just really like that cover. We could have it in here, it will be kicked out anyways. Now, in order for Cinema to read this, we need to clean this file and get rid of all the information that Cinema does not understand. The simplest way of doing that, or the only way of doing that, is saving the file. I usually save it as a prep version. Oops. Prep, just like I would do with Illustrator files for Photoshop, for After Effects. I will then save it, and here I will save it as an older version, and I want to always save it as Illustrator 8. I remember this. I just like go through the list, and I take the oldest version where there's no jump. You know, so everything here, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 10, 9, 8, but then there's the jump. So I take the oldest version that is not like the oldest. I don't know. I guess they were special. So, Illustrator 8. And Illustrator 8 just makes sure that everything is really outlined, that there's no additional weird stuff that Cinema would not understand, because in Illustrator 8 you did not have all these special things. So, I hit OK, and then we have the prep file. So over here, I already gave it to you in the folder that you got today. In the preview, it looks like nothing, because in Illustrator 8, apparently, you also did not have colors. I guess. I don't know. So anyways, in this file, it's really just the raw paths. No colors, no anything. If I open this up, I can see, oh wait, the image is actually still there. Just the preview doesn't show me everything. Anyway. The Illustrator 8 file, or the prep file, is now the file that we can open in Cinema, just like we'd open a regular Cinema file. So I would drop this onto the Cinema icon. Now I get an import box, and I have a couple of options. First, I can give this an initial scale. However, the scale of 1 centimeter is usually fine. Just keep it this way. Then we have two options. We can connect the splines, or we can group the splines, or we can group, no, that's it. Pretty much these two. Let's take a look at what these things do. If I say connect splines and I hit open, I can see I get a group here, and I do have a couple of paths. However, when I select a path, I will realize, this is not really what I was looking for. So some things are a little bit merged. So here, this is one path, so I could not extrude both of them separately. If we tell Cinema to connect the splines, it will kind of see where there are overlaps, and it will think that these things belong together, and they will export it as one spline. There might be scenarios where this makes sense, but in this case it doesn't. So let's try this again. In the next option, if we say we want to group the splines and we hit OK, it kind of does a similar thing, but without merging everything together. So here I can see, if I select this, I actually again have this connection here, but when I open it up, I actually have still the separate paths here. So I can extrude everything separately. However, again, still things are grouped kind of in a weird way. Just because they are close together, Cinema now thinks they should be grouped. So also, in some cases, this might make sense, but in most, it doesn't. Last option is not doing anything. So if we turn this off and just hit OK, I can see I actually get groups, like I created groups in Cinema. I don't know what group 1 is. I can see how I have the separate paths for my outer parts. I have the group for my back part. I have the group for the other back part, the group for the front, and for the other front. And inside the groups, I also have each element separately. Not quite sure why it's also in a group, but also I don't really care. So this appears to be the most efficient option. Let me import that again and show you what the next steps are. So here, don't check anything and just hit OK. Next, I want to extrude the elements. I think first I will get rid of the group. There are two ways of doing that. You can either select all the children and move them out and just delete the group, or there's a functionality that is called, when you right click, there, delete without children. So then they're like Batman. Alright, next we could arrange this a bit. We could also give them names. The nice thing is, when we select it, it gets this outline so we know what it is. So this would be weak inner, this would be end inner, weak outer, and end outer. And this, I don't know, I just keep them path 1, 2, 3. When I now want to extrude them, I need to place them inside of a group. Oh, wait, before I delete the parent, there's one more thing that I wanted to do. No, let's do it now. Because when we take a look at this file, you might have realized that the world is not here. The world center is back there. The reason for that is that in Illustrator, the world or the origin is not in the center. In After Effects, it's in the top left corner. For Photoshop, it's in the top left corner. And in Illustrator as well. The origin is in the top left corner. So, when we import this file, the position for each path gets calculated from the origin, which is here. And that's why it looks like it has this offset. What I usually do to fix this, I take some elements that have anchor points where I want them to be. For instance, if I take my weak inner and the end inner. If I select both of them, their shared anchor point looks like it's kind of in the center, right? So I will group them together. I hit Alt-G, and now I have a null object with the center where I want it to be. I then drag everything, drop it inside of that group, and I can then tell this group to be centered. And now this sits in a place where it makes more sense to me. Then I can kill the parent, and I'm back to where I was before. Since when does it invert the children? Did you notice? Like when it's still in the parent, I have my groups up here and then 3, 2, 1. But when I kill the parent, it's 1, 2, 3 and the groups at the bottom. Like, it doesn't really matter, since the hierarchy, it doesn't matter if something is above or below, it just matters if something is parented or not. But still, it's weird. Anyway. Now I want to extrude a couple of things. I know that the weak and the end, the front layers, should be extruded the same way. So I would just create an extrude, which is now nicely placed in the center, and I will take the weak inner and the end inner and put it inside of the extrude. But nothing happens because of two things. First, an extrude can only work with one element. Let me quickly show you. If I have, for instance, a circle, and I have a rectangle, and I have an extrude, and I place both of them inside here, the extrude will only take whichever element is in here first, and everything else will be ignored. So the extrude is only capable of extruding one thing. That's it. So this apparently does not work. In some cases you can fake it. You could say that I want to that I create a null object, place everything inside the null object, and then I place it together in the extrude. For some objects this works. It then kind of detects, alright, so this is just one element, so I will work with that one. But in this case, apparently this is still not enough. The extrude is like, well, this is not a path, I don't know what to do. This is just a point. And inside of the point are multiple elements, but again the extrude says, nah, just this one. And if this one is not correct, I'm not going to do it. So what we want to do is use the connect. So the connect, again, just forces the element to be its most raw and basic format and merged as one. If I now place the connect inside of the extrude, ta-da! It works. It is important, however, I think, that these two elements are inside of a group. No, actually not. The connect works fine this way. All good. Then I would say, let's get to this point together and create the extrusions for the front text and the outer text. Oh, and the rendering's done. Yay! And it should look nice and soft and clean. Isn't it? Alrighty. The other nice thing about this is, if you take something else, you now have a light setup that you can just reuse. So for instance, if you have built something else, you could be like, well, let me save this. I don't need these things over here anymore, but the main light setup is still there, and now I have my figure that I want to render. So I can now hit render, and now I'm rendering this figure in this nice light setup. So you don't have to set up the light and the floor and stuff like this again. Alright. So we start by opening up the prep file. You can do that by simply dragging it. I'm not sure. No, yeah, you can just drag it onto Cinema. Do not drag it into the editor here, because I think then it will open up. Oh no. In earlier versions, it opened up in the picture viewer and it was just showing the Illustrator file as an image. So in the Illustrator import options, we don't want to connect the splines or group them, so disable both options here and hit OK. It should now look like this. So far so good. Next, we want to get rid of this parent here. So we right click on it and we will say delete without children. Yeah, we'll do it together. So just
to import.
Just go to File and Open. The other one. That one doesn't work. Uncheck. Both. Okay. Then delete the parent. Right click and then delete without children. Good. Next, we have this group 1. Not quite sure where this comes from, but it's empty, so we can delete it. Then we can start renaming the groups. When you select a group, it should be highlighted, and you should know then what it is. So this would be end outer. This would be weak outer and inner and weak inner. Next, we want to make sure that all of this kind of sits in the center here. For that, we will select both the weak inner and the end inner. Both groups had their anchor points already nicely in the center of the texts. And by selecting both of them, we get a shared anchor point right in between both of them. I think this is close enough to the center. Then we hold down Alt and hit G to group them together. And then we can place the other elements inside of the group as well. So now we have a new parent which has the anchor point in the center of this thing. So far so good? Next, we want this to be back in the center of the world. For that, we just need to have the parent selected and zero out the values that we have here. You can focus on an element, by the way, by hitting H.
But how does cinema detect which element?
H actually selects, focuses on everything that you have in the scene, and S focuses on the element that you have selected.
Okay.
So if you hit H, it will just go to a place where you can see kind of everything within the scene. And if you have a specific element selected, for instance the E, and I hit S, I will focus on that one element.
Okay.
Now we want to get rid of the parent, so we right click on it, and again we say delete without children. We only used it in order to get this into a position that is more convenient for us. So far so good? Next, we want to extrude both the weak and the end. For that, we first create a connector, because we know that these two things need to be connected. So we create a connector, and we take the end inner and the weak inner and drop it inside of the connect. We can then call this one maybe text inner. Then we can place this inside of an extrude, so we create an extrude and drop the text inside of the extrude. And maybe we call the extrude the same way, so text inner.
Wait, to delete the null without to delete everything?
Right click on the null and say delete without children.
Again, of course.
So we should now have something like this. So place the two inner inside. Now you might notice one thing, which is that this is blue, and usually our stuff is gray, right?
It's gray.
Green, but yeah.
Yeah, this is blue, and normally stuff is gray.
Okay, dark gray or light gray?
Space gray.
This is blue.
How can this be blue? What is your perception of blue?
This is blue.
The arrow of the z-axis. This is blue.
It is actually defined as gray blue.
So we were both right.
Let me make a screenshot. And when I pick the color, can I just pick the color? Will it bother? See?
Oh.
This is totally a blue.
But also in the gray area.
Yeah, but it's still a blue, a very desaturated one, but it's still a blue. Alright, anyway, so for some reason, and I don't know why, but when we open up an Illustrator file, Cinema will ignore all the preset settings that we did. Remember in the first class we had like our new and template files that we saved in the Cinema 4D folder? Yes, Leonard, we remember. That was so smart. And we usually now don't have to think about settings. But if we now go here to the render settings, we can see that it's reset to the standard renderer. And I can also see that the frame rate of my document is set to 30 frames per second. So everything is just messed up. So whenever you see this blue color, what you should do is copy everything. So select everything, hit Command C to copy it, create a new document which now has our preset settings, and just hit Command V to paste the elements inside. So on an Illustrator file, Cinema takes the most basic settings that are saved with Cinema itself, and it ignores our presets. So as soon as you realize, oh, this is grayish stuff, create a new document and paste your elements inside of there, and then you're working in an environment that is more familiar to us. Alright, so the text inner we want to extrude into a negative value, so it goes to the left. So we select the text inner, and here for the movement we change the third value to maybe -5. It should look then like this.
Did you get rid of the extrude?
Why would I get rid of the extrude?
The other direction.
I just changed it from +20 to -5. Got it? All right. Then we want to do kind of the same thing with the end outer and the weak outer. So again, we create a connect and an extrude. We place the end outer and weak outer inside of the connect. We could call this one again text outer, and drop the connect inside the extrude and call it the same. Now this one should extrude towards the back. Because I feel like sometimes it's hard to see things, I like to change my display to growth shading lines, and then it's just much easier to look at and see where things are happening. So far, so good? All right. What do we want next? I think I don't want the outer text to be extruded as much. So here I would change it to 5. And then we can also still do this together, add more extrudes to our paths here. And we do the same thing as before. We just create an extrude. Whoops, wrong one. We can actually also just copy paste it 3 times and drop the paths inside of it. So far, so good.
What?
Yeah, it's sound, right?
Yeah, just scrolling up and scrolling down and scrolling up and scrolling down.
Oh yeah. Don't ask me why.
I won't. Are we good? All right. The next steps I will do first. Afterwards, we will do it together. Now, I want first, I think, a couple of materials here, just so that I can see a little bit clearer what is what. I will create a new material. I will keep the reflectance on this time, and I will change the brightness to 100% so it's white. I will duplicate this material, and this one here will get a greenish color, which will be for my text. So this goes to the text inner, this to the text outer, and then I have sort of a bluish color for all three of these. Alright, so I feel like I do have these intersections here, so I definitely want all of these paths here to be a little bit further to the back. So I select all of them, make sure I'm in the model mode and the move tool, and I can move it on the z-axis just a little bit backwards. I will adjust this further on later anyways, but just to give it a starting position here. Maybe even a little bit further. Then I also want these to be a little bit less deep. So with all of them selected, I can see I have 3 elements selected. I can change the depth here to 2.5. I want this to be fairly thin. Then everything should have just a little bit of a bevel on the edges. So it's rounding. Do you remember where to put this? In the caps, and it's the fillet cap, exactly. So I can select all extrudes at the same time. I can see that it detects that there are values that are the same and some values that are different. So here it says that there are multiple values in here. So here, for instance, I could also say that everything should be 20. Now everything gets extruded the same way. I can then go to the caps, and I would know that I want the fillet caps. By default, it is way too thick and also not subdivided enough. So I do get a cap, but there's no subdivision, so I don't get any rounding. If I do want a rounding, I need to add more values, more steps in here. So maybe 5. And then I have a nice rounding. Then I don't want it to be that deep, so I change this value to 1. Yeah, looks about right. Now the text is fine the way it is. I don't intend to bend it, and I also feel like the subdivision here looks fine. So when I'm especially in my garage shading, I don't see any edges here. This looks nice and round enough for me, especially when I'm looking at it from a little bit further away. This one here, however, I'm not too happy with. I can see how there's a straight line here and a straight line there and there. Also, when I take a look at it again in my garage shading with lines, I can see that there are just some very long polygons that don't have any subdivisions. How do we fix this? How do we make this more natural?
More kicks.
More what?
Kicks.
Kicks? Okay, yeah. So I would open up the extrusions. I select all my paths, and down here I change the intermediate points to natural. And I can immediately see before and after how this looks rounder and nicer, at least in this spot here. Down here I kind of feel like it got worse, but that's fine because I can just increase the number of subdivisions until it looks fine here as well. So 25 looks like a nice round number, and I have a nice and regular grid without some weird issues. Next, I know that I want to bend these things a little bit forward and deform them kind of freehand. If we take a look at the final example, here we can see how it goes kind of like from the back and goes into the front. And here also, because of the shading, we can see how there's a little bit bending. So over here we have these n-gons, and we know that with these n-gons we will get some issues, right? So what do we do in order to not get issues when we deform this? By adding a grid. So back on our subdivisions, on the extrudes, we go to the caps, scroll down, and change the type from n-gons to quadrangles. Here we then can already see this is what the n-gons would give us, and especially here we just don't have the subdivision that we want. So we enable a regular grid. This could already be enough, but if we feel like maybe this is not enough, we just decrease the width of these quadrangles that we have. So each quadrangle will be 10 by 10. Now it's 9 by 9, and so on. And here we could just give it something like 5, I think, should be good enough to give us a nice resolution to deform it without getting any issues. Because we had all of them selected at the same time, we now have all the properties the same on all the elements. Let's do this together. We first create a couple of materials. We double click in the empty area down here and double click on the material. We do keep the reflectance this time, and on the color we change it to white. Then we create another material. I would make it green. This will be my text. In the front. And another one which will be blue. For these wings, kind of. Then we can just apply it by dropping it onto the elements in our hierarchy. So text outer will be white, text inner will be green, and the blue material goes onto our paths. Next, we see that we do have this little bit of an intersection. So when you see artifacts like this, that means we have geometry that is exactly overlapping. Since Cinema doesn't use layers, it does not know which one it should prefer. So in After Effects, when we have things that are exactly intersecting with each other, it will always show the element that is in the hierarchy on top. Since Cinema does not have a layered hierarchy like this, it just does not know what it should do. So depending on the camera angle that we have, it will take one or the other, or just this weird combination of both. So let's select all the paths and move them back just a little bit. So with them selected, having the move tool active and the model mode, we can move this a little bit to the back. Then, still with all the extrudes here selected, or the 3. Oh, by the way, if you don't see the attributes anymore that belong to it, just deselect one of them and select it again by holding down the command key. And then you get the attributes here back for those elements. Then we go to Object and change the extrusion to 2.5. This one here, the movement. Then we know that everything should get these caps. So now we select all of our paths. So not only path 1, 2, 3, but the text outer and text inner as well. Go to the caps. Change the start to fillet cap as well as the end. Choose a radius of 1. and steps of 5. It should then look like this. If you don't see these lines here, go to Display and go to Shading with Lines.
How does it look for you? Can you
Oh. All right. Oh, 1. So far, so good? Good. Next, we want to fix the paths that we have. So let's select path 1 to 3 again. Go to the type and change it from n-gons to quadrangles. Enable the regular grid. And I would change the width of the grid to 5. Now we can see that we get some issues here. So we have a lot of quadrangles that need to be connected to something, but we don't have enough stuff down here to connect it to. So, also, because we want this to be nicer and rounder, we will open up all of our paths and select the paths. So not the extrude, but the actual spline. Then we change the intermediate points to natural and increase the value to 25. We should then see that also the grid looks much more easy. There are no long distances that it needs to travel in order to be connected to something.
What number did you choose?
25. So far, so good? All right. Next, I will do the next steps first, and afterwards we will do them together. What I want to do is, I want to deform these elements, but I want to get kind of crazy. I don't just want to bend it in one direction and that's it. I really wanted to fluidly go in front and back and do whatever. The best way of doing that is with a deformer, which is called the FFD deformer, which stands for freeform deformer, or freeform deformation, I think. As with all the deformers, it needs to be applied to an element by being grouped inside of it. So let's take the path 2, and I drag the FFD inside. Oh, let me actually save. I drop it inside here. So you can see how the extrusion disappears because the FFD is right now the first element, and the extrude says, well, I don't know what this is, so I'm not going to do anything. So the FFD needs to be placed underneath the spline. I can then tell the FFD, just like with the taper, for instance, to fit to the parent. However, it does not really detect it so well. I can see that it's actually a little bit too little. We can see how it doesn't detect the rounding that we did. Because of the rounding, the element got thicker, but the FFD doesn't detect it. So what I usually do is I make the FFD on all the sides a little bit larger. Otherwise, I run into issues. Let me show you these issues that I mean. In that example, it's a little bit hard to see. If I have a sphere, for instance, and I place an FFD inside of it, like this, but the FFD does not get to everything. What the FFD does is, I can select points and move them, and it will then deform my object based on this. All right? So here you can see, even though this is a sphere, a primitive, I can still grab points of it, or a simplified version, and do with this whatever I want. However, it only works with elements that are within this thing. So if I now move this to the side, you can see how it does not move these points, because they are not inside of the FFT deformer. So with the FFT deformer, you want to make sure that it's always just a little bit larger than the original element, to make sure that really everything is moved. Now here, I will optimize this a little bit. I don't need these points here. I think they are the points on the z-axis. So I reduce my z-axis to 2, which means 1 and 2 points on the z-axis. I do want a couple of more across the x-axis, so I increase the points on my x-axis, like this. I don't want too many though, maybe something like this. What I can then do is, for instance, take my rectangle selection, go to the point mode, and start selecting points, like this, and I can then move them to the front. And then these ones here could be moved to the back. So I can, this way, really freeform this however I want. I can even, I could also rotate this around and really get crazy with this. Let me show you how to do it on this one, and then I would say everyone just does it however he or she feels like.
Yes.
But first, let me show you one more. So for the one at the bottom, it's also fairly simple, because if I add my FFT deformer down here, which would be path 1, I can also say fit to parent. Oh no, path 1 is already this one. Yeah, so here it's a little bit weird. Hello, what do I have selected? What? Oh, I'm choosing the wrong key. I'm stupid. So here I have the issue that I don't want my grid to be this way. I rather want my grid to be rotated. So when I say fit to parent, it takes on the axis of this. So I could rotate this and say, well, but I want it like this. But when I say fit to parent, it'll be like, no. So we'll take on the axis and then just fit to the size. What we could try is, I'm not quite sure if it works, let me just see. What we could try is adjusting the anchor point of our group here, or of the extrusion. So if I rotate this, I can see it rotates the entire element, but when I go into this axis mode, it only rotates the parent without the children. Ooh. So now I can already see that the boundary also changes. And if I now take the FFT deformer, I place it inside here, and I say fit to parent, it now also matches with the rotation. Let me quickly show you what this thing here is again. If I have a primitive and I convert it to a polygonal object, I can see that I have this axis in here. And everything that I do happens from this axis. So when I scale, it scales from the axis. When I rotate, it rotates around that axis. But what if I want the axis to be somewhere else? For instance, down here. What I would do is, I would enable the axis mode. And now, whatever I do, might it be scaling, rotating, or changing the position, although scale has no effect, then I will change the axis, but not the element. So when I now move this, I just define where this anchor point should be. It's just like the anchor point in After Effects, where we can also say it doesn't have to be in the center, it can also be in the top left corner, for instance. Now, in order to now move the element again, I need to disable the axis mode. The axis mode also has the shortcut L to turn this on and off. Yeah, a little bit.
Easy shortcut, because you can see.
Yeah, it kind of looks like it. So if you ever move an axis, but the element or the children does not move along with it, double check if you might have the axis mode enabled. Now, I can, for instance, rotate it around like this, which is something I could not have done earlier. Earlier I would have need to animate the position and the rotation. But now, because my axis is here, it moves a bit more the way that I would want it to. So changing the axis can be quite helpful sometimes, especially in this case where I can rotate the parent's axis without changing the position of the child, and therefore fixing my FFT deformer. All right. I would say let's do this together, and then we just keep on doing this for a bit. Let's start with the path 2. First, we create the FFT deformer up here. We open up the path 2 extrusion object, and we drop the FFT deformer inside of it, but underneath the actual path 2 spline. Don't move it too far down. If you move it too far down, then it will be outside of the group, so it needs to be pointing inside of the extrude in order to work. Then you should be able to hit the fit to parent key, and then it should be roughly the size of the parent. Then, as we know, the FFT deformer rather should be a little bit larger than the object because it doesn't detect the extrusion the way that we would want it to. We'll just take the grid size values and increase all of them a little bit. So here just a little bit, up there a little bit, and the depth a little bit. There are no right or wrong values. Just look at it, and if it looks like it's now easily inside of it, then you're good. Next, I don't think that we need this additional line here. It's just too many points that we need to worry about. So the grid points Z, I would get to the lowest value, which is 2. Then we do want some additional points across here. So the x-axis we will increase, or the grid points for the x-axis. And there maybe 12. The nice thing is that you can even change the amount of points here afterwards. Let me quickly show you that. If I switch to my selection mode up here, the rectangle selection, and I go to the point mode, I could, for instance, say that I have these points, and I move them to the back. If I then say, I now have so many points and I don't want to worry about those, I can decrease the amount of points, and you can see how Cinema tries to still incorporate the same shape that you did, but now with less points. So here, if I decrease this, it tries to keep that change that I did as close as possible. If I increase the points afterwards, however, it does not get back to the shape that it was before. So as soon as you change points, it forgets everything that it did earlier. So usually you want to make sure that you already know beforehand how many points you have. But you can also know that you don't mess everything up if you increase it a little bit or decrease the amount of points. Now, to change this, you switch here to the rectangle selection, and you need to have the point mode enabled because we're changing points of the FFT deformer. We can now grab some points by clicking and dragging across them, and we can just move them around. So this here can now be in the front. And then maybe back here, it starts to go back. With Shift, you can select more points, and with Control, you can deselect points.
the first rectangle?
I'm having this weird depression when I shift forward.
This one.
What?
I'm having this depression in between.
Depression?
Yeah, like when I push it forward, I'm having something in the middle that is not coming forward.
Then you don't have those points selected. So hold on Shift and make sure that you have the points in the middle selected as well.
Okay, I didn't select the FFT. I was actually moving the points on the
Mm.
file.
How are you doing that? Moves between. What? How do you do that it moves between those things?
I moved a couple of points up in the back.
Up?
Yeah, so that it's not down here but a little bit higher.
Mm.
And as you can see, I also moved these ones here a lot closer, so they were before here. And the closer I drag them here, the sharper the corner can get.
Okay. Makes sense. Did you move the whole thing up? Not just some points.
No, just the points in the back. But I could move the entire thing up as well. Those are way too many points.
Yeah, but to try to go inside, it can be too big. Let's look if I do this way. Okay.
I moved them up a little bit. Between this is too close. I moved it back here, up there. There's more room.
For me, it looks totally messed up.
Alright.
So to do the left one, the first thing that we want to do is adjust the anchor point with it, so that the FFT deformer is then also at an angle applied. So this is the path 1. Let's select the path 1. Make sure that we are in the model mode and the move tool. And then we enable the axis, like this. Now we can rotate the axis by hitting R and rotating it around the Z-axis until it points kind of in the direction that this thing goes. So this red line kind of points towards it. Then we disable the axis mode so we don't forget it. Create the FFD deformer, place it inside of the path 1, or yeah, inside of it here. Fit to parent, And just like before, we need to increase all the sizes here. It's a bit longer and wider, and definitely a little bit deeper. What's up? Alright, so here for the path 1. Oh, I launched it already. So just a couple of more points for the x-axis. I don't need that many for this one here, I think. Bless you.
Thanks. Thank you too.
Maybe because this is angled, it might be a bit easier to choose a different tool for selection. So here maybe the lasso tool is a little bit easier. So when we here, again.
Thanks.
Make sure that you're in the point mode, and then you can also make a lasso selection around the points that you want to select. And this might be a little bit easier.
Do you cut it out if people sneeze?
No.
No. Okay. And somebody's watching him and then he's like throwing away his computer because he's so afraid. What the fuck? Jump scare. Do you know who this is outside? Somebody knows? Huh? What did he say? What did he say? Oh. It didn't sound like nothing. There was something coming out of the mouth.
So how do you make the selection like that?
Up here, instead of the rectangle selection, it's the lasso selection.
Exactly what it was made for.
All right. I would say we now have our break, like this 20 minutes, 25. And then we continue with the last one. Then we just duplicate the ones that we have, arrange them a bit, giving them a different color and deforming them so that everything comes together nicely in the center here so we don't have any open ends. And then we talk about the rendering. So we should by now have two of them kind of bent, and let's now take care of the last one, and the last one is pretty much just like the other ones. And then afterwards we will duplicate them, give them different deformations and colors, and then we talk about the rendering. But for now, I will not do first, we'll just do it kind of all together. And I'll just narrate what I do. So we are at path 3. So we create the new FFD deformer, place it inside the path 3, and say fit to parent. Just like before, I would say that we don't need any grid points on the Z, maybe not even on the Y, and we increase the size on all axes just a little bit. Then we increase the grid point size, in this case actually, on the Y. And then just do our thing. So with the lasso tool and the point mode, grab some points. So far so good? All right. Then let's duplicate them kind of one by one. I would start with, let's start with path 3. To duplicate it, we hold down the Control key and drag it upwards. We should now have a path called 3.1. In order to not get them confused, I would also give them a new material. I think also these steps we can do together. Fairly simple stuff. So let's duplicate the last material one more time. And this time, let's give it a different color. I'll choose kind of a purple. And apply this to the 3.1. Then I want this to actually be flipped. So with the 3.1 selected, we go to the coordinates in the attributes panel, and we will change either the x or the y axis to a negative value, so -1. So it should now look like this. Then we can switch to the model mode and take the entire thing and maybe move this back a little bit like this, and maybe rotate it also just so that it looks nice.
Can you show how you flipped it again?
Select the layer, go to the coordinates, and change the y-axis to -1. So far so good? Next, we can duplicate the path 2. This time, we rather want to duplicate it on the x-axis. Flip it on the x-axis. Give it also another material. Oops. And then we can rotate it around. Maybe also switch to the scale tool and change the size of this a bit. Bless you. And then for the last one, so the path 1, again, duplicating it, flipping it maybe on the x-axis. Although, no, the y-axis. And applying the second material. So far so good? I can wait a bit. The next steps, actually, let's now talk about this mess here in the center. It will be a little bit tricky to fix, but essentially you just use the model mode, and I like to be in the move tool for this. Select a path, for instance this one here. Here I see an edge and I don't like this edge, so I click on the element. So apparently this is path 2.1. Then open it up, go to the FFD deformer, to the point mode, and it's kind of hard to see, so I'll just randomly draw a selection here and hope to get some points that affect that layer in a way that I can hide the end at some place here where I won't see it in the end. And then I continue doing that for the other layers as well. So in the model mode and the move tool, I click on a layer, open it up, select the FFD, point mode, and selection tool.
Doesn't want to select anything.
I'll come to you in a bit. If you're having trouble selecting the correct points because they might be a little bit further away, what you can do is have the FFD deformer selected, and then on the left hand side here there's an S sphere. When you click and hold on it, you can switch to the view solo single, a viewport solo single. And that will show you only that object. And then you can see, alright, so these are the points that I want to move. You can go back by clicking on it again and dragging and choosing the viewport solo off. So far so good, or shall I wait a bit longer?
A little bit.
Alright. So, the next steps I will do first. Afterwards, we can do them together. What I now want is some render setup, and I want some nice shadows to be cast in the back here. So the first thing that I need is something that can have a shadow cast on. For that, I will create a plane, and I will rotate that plane. I hit R for the rotation, make sure that I'm in the model mode, and I rotate it around the x-axis. While I rotate, I start to hold down Shift to rotate it in 10-degree increments to go to 90 degrees. I can then grab these sides here and just make it super large. I will give it the same blue material, and with the move tool, I will move it back so that it doesn't intersect with any of my elements, like this. Now, maybe the deformers right now look a little bit irritating, so I can go to Filter and say that I want to turn off deformers, and then it's just a little bit nicer to look at. Maybe rotating with lines and isoparms is the easiest way of looking at it while still seeing everything. Then I need some lights in here. For that, I will take some area lights as well. So here, an area light, I will draw this back. Now I want the area light to always point towards the center here. What I'll do for that is, I will right-click on the light, go to Cinema 4D tags, and I will choose a target tag. In the target tag, I can then place the plane, and now, it doesn't matter where I move the light, it will automatically rotate and look at the center. Now this light here should be fairly large, something like this, a little bit further back, and I want it to be a bit higher. Now obviously this should cast shadows, so I select the light. I will go to the General tab and I enable Area Shadows. I will also go to my options, enable Open Enhanced GL, Enhanced OpenGL, and I will enable my shadows here, so I get a rough feeling of where the shadows will be. So something like this looks fine. Then I want a second light, so I hold down Control as I move the light to the side. And this one I think I want to be a little bit lower and a little bit more centered, like this. Then, this already looks kind of cool. Then I want a camera that is exactly centered onto this. For that, I will create a new camera. I will look through it, and I will zero out my values. I know that I want it to be zeroed out on X and Y, and I want no rotation. And now I'm looking exactly from the front at it. I also want, in the end, it to render as a square, so kind of Instagram style. For that, I will go to my render settings, to the output, make sure that the ratio is not locked, and I will choose, I think, 1000 by 1000. I can see how the boundary has been adjusted here as well. So you can see this darker part here. So dark means in the final rendering this will not be rendered. This will be cropped. Alrighty. Now, just like with the other example, we know that lights look more realistic and have a nicer fall off when we go to the details and we actually add a fall off. The inverse square, physically accurate. We might want to adjust the radius of the lights so that the colors don't explode, so I don't want it to be too bright, or something like this. And I think I also want a vignette of the camera, so I go to my camera, to the vignette intensity, and choose something like 25. I can now hit the render button to see what I'm getting. Alright, so A, this takes super long to render. In the end it will also take super long to render. And B, my shadows look still a little bit too darkish. So they are pretty grayish as well. So not really the look that I'm looking for. I want this to also look fairly soft and nice, and I don't want my shadows to look like they are reddish or something. So, first, I will fix the blackness of the shadows, which will also fix a little bit of the coloration issues that we have. I will create a sky, and I will tell the sky to have the same material as my blue color. Alternatively, to not get confused, what I can also do is copy the color here, create a new material, let's call this one sky, turn only on the luminance, and here right click and paste the same color on top. I will apply that color to my sky. When I now render, for some reason it will render a little bit faster, and my entire scene gets this bluish tint to it. And my shadows get that bluish tint as well. So everything looks a lot softer and nicer as compared to before. You can see how super quickly this rendered now. Now it only took 15 seconds. Let me take a quick screenshot here. I'm not allowed to. There we go. And if I rendered without the sky, for some reason it takes much, much longer. I cannot tell you why. In my head, I would be like, I have just lights and not a sky. It should render quicker, but for some reason that's not true. So as soon as you have a sky in there, it will render significantly faster when we have GI enabled. So here, let me just take a screenshot already and compare this. This is how it looked before, and this is how it looks after. So brighter, softer, and the shadows are nicer as well. Now I don't think that I want it to be that intense. I don't want everything to be that bluish, just a little bit, especially in the shadows. So instead of using the full intensity of the sky, I would just move it down to maybe 50%. So in the luminance channel, change the brightness. I change the brightness to 50. If I now render, it still renders faster. It is closer to the look that I had before, but my shadows are getting a little bit of this coloration with it, especially here in the dark areas. It's a little bit brighter than before, and it also renders quicker. Let's do this together. All right. The first thing that we want is the background. So we go to our cube and we choose a plane. The plane we want to rotate, and I prefer to do this in the model mode. Then with the rotation tool, rotating around the x-axis, holding down shift to constrain it. So 90 degrees. Then make it large enough so that it covers the entire scene. And with the move tool, I move it backwards so that nothing intersects with it. Then, to see everything a little bit better, I suggest turning off the deformers down here.
Will those be reset for the next document? Or do like maybe when I want something certain?
I think these ones are always remembered, so even if you switch to a different document, it will remember what you have selected here. Then I would also go to display and choose garrote shading with lines.
Sorry, how do you turn on the thing?
Filter, deformer.
On the top panel.
Here, there it is.
Where is it now? Oh, I see it.
So filter, turn deformers off. Then under display, we change it to garrote shading with lines. And we go into the same display menu again and change from wireframe to isopalms. And I think this is, in this scenario, the easiest solution to look at it. Then the background, I would give it the same blue color. And now I want some lights in here. Over here, we choose the area light. And we can already move it back a little bit. Oh, that was not back. This is back. On this light, we want to make sure that it always looks at the element, so we right-click on it, go to Cinema 4D tags, and choose the target tag, fairly at the bottom of the list. Then, in the target tag, we have the target object field, and we drag the plane inside of there. So now, when we move the light, it always looks at the plane, or at the center of the plane. I want that light to be quite a bit larger, and a little bit higher maybe. But to figure out the final position that I want, I should see my shadows to get a better feeling of how the shadows will be cast. So we will select the light, go to the General tab, and enable the area shadows. Then, in order to see a preview of the shadows in our editor, we need to go to the options, make sure that Enhanced OpenGL is enabled, and then click on Shadows. And then we get a preview of how the shadows are being cast. Then I want a second light. So just like earlier, holding down Control and dragging the light to duplicate it. And this one, I want to be a little bit more frontal and centered.
But more far away.
Yeah, about the same. So far, so good. Then let's do a quick render. You can either use the top left render button or hit Command R. And it should look something like this. Getting to there. Next, we want to make sure that these lights have their fall-offs set up correctly. So let's select both lights, go to the Details tab, scroll down, and enable a fall-off of inverse square physically accurate. Then everything might become even larger, so we just decrease the radius/decay until we have a brightness that feels about right. You can also hit the render button to see how it actually looks like, because the editor just has a rough calculation of what it thinks it will look like in the end. So far, so good? Next, let's set up our camera. So we create a new camera, make sure that we are looking right through the camera, and then we zero out everything except for the Z position. So here on the x-axis, 0, y, 0, and the rotations all also 0. It should then look at our scene perfectly centered. Then we can also set up our render settings already correctly so that we have our square view. So we go to the render settings, and in the output we change the width and height both to 1000. If you also want the editor here to only render out these areas, the only thing that you can do is just change the size of that window. So here,
1000 pixels?
1000 pixels. I can just match this to the grayed out area, and then I have a better idea of what will be my final image. So here I zoom in a little bit more, like this. And on my camera, since I already have it selected, I will go to the physical tab and add a vignetting intensity of 25. Bless you. By the way, if there's ever a panel that annoys you, for instance, right now I can hardly adjust my materials here because this panel is too large. You can always minimize the panel by holding down the Command key and clicking on this dotted square. If I click on it, it gets minimized over here, and when I click on it again, this time without the Command key, it gets opened up. So Command clicking closes and regular clicking opens it up. If I just click on it without the Command key, I get some options for that panel. Alright, next, to decrease render time and improve the shadowing that we have, we want to add a sky. So up here, we will go to the sky. And I want the sky to have the same bluish color.
How do you move again in the row?
If you click in an empty area and click and drag. Then we have the sky, and we want a material that has the same blue color here. So we open up the blue color, and in the color channel we can click on the name color here, right click and say copy. Then when we create a new material and we turn off reflectance and color and enable luminance, we can right click on the color of the luminance and say paste. Right click on the color.
Here.
No, on where it says color. You already have it highlighted.
The text. Yeah.
Did you click on it?
I think so.
No, you need to also here, right click.
Copy.
Copy.
There,
Mm-hmm.
Copy.
Not there.
Okay. Oh, it's the same.
No, turn off the color and reflectance, and you want to put it on the luminance. And there on the color. Yes. So far so good? Alright. Now, I already know that I don't want it to be that intense, so I changed the brightness here to 50%. Then we apply the sky material to the sky. When we then hit render, it should render a little bit quicker, and everything should look a little bit softer, the shadows not as grayed out. So far so good? Alright. Now, I do want a couple of more things to be optimized. I will do it first, afterwards we can do it together. I feel like these shadows here are still a little bit too grayish. Actually, let me document my process. I lock my ratio here and I switch it to 500 pixels so it will render a little bit quicker, and I will turn off the save option here. So when I now hit the render button, it will render to here, and fairly quickly because it's just 500 by 500. Now, the shadows are still too grayish for my taste. So I will go into my lights and I can go into the shadow property. In here, I can then give the shadows kind of the same bluish color, but fairly dark. So something like this, maybe 20% of brightness. If I now render this, I can see how my shadows have become a little bit brighter and also a little bit more colored. So when I compare this, this is the before, and this is the after. It's just a very subtle change. But up here I can see how it is just a bit more saturated. Maybe I can make it even brighter, maybe even 30%. Next, I feel like it looks a little bit too, a little bit too flattish. So what I will do is, I will go to my render settings and I will add ambient occlusion. Here, of course, I also want this sort of blue color as the darkest place. So here I'll choose kind of the same bluish color again. Also like 20% or so, 20-30%. And I will increase the maximum ray length to around 400. So when I now render this, everything will have this super dark shadow around it, and it will just support the shapes of everything. Especially the white areas here don't look so overexposed anymore and much more 3D-ish and defined. So here, the before and the after, the ambient occlusion. So it looks much more 3D-ish. Less realistic, but this is not an example to render something realistic. This is something that should just look cool and dynamic. So here, ambient occlusion is a nice addition to it. Next, now let's first get to this point together, and then we will add some last touches. So we want the shadows to be a little bit more bluish, or whatever background color you've chosen. So we select the lights, go to the shadow tab, and give it a little bit of a color. Maybe 30% in the brightness, and then roughly the tint of the background color. Down here, the V value.
So it doesn't have to be exactly this color.
No. Then we also want this super dark shadow around it. So we go to the render settings. We will click on Effect, and we will choose Ambient Occlusion. In there, we will double click on the black bucket, and we will choose again the same bluish color.
Again, 30%.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Super dark.
It is super dark.
Also for the shadow thing from the lights, right? It's dark.
Mm-hmm. The maximum ray length I would increase to 400 centimeters.
Oh.
And then we can hit the render button and see what we get.
Weekend.
So far, so good. All right. Now, the last thing that I want to adjust is the way that my light gets reflected on my elements. Right now, it looks okay, but I want this to be a little bit more dynamic. I will do it first. Afterwards, we do it together. I will do it with the blue material first, because that way I see it on fairly large elements here and also on the background. I will go into my material, into the reflectance, and I will delete the default specular. Then I will click the Add button and I will add a Beckman reflection. If you're interested and where the differences between them are, you can right-click here. Here you can choose Beckmann or the others. You can right-click on the type and show help. And here you can see exactly how each reflection type behaves differently. So, not so much.
What? Not so much.
So here you can see this is the Beckmann reflection with different roughnesses.
Yep.
This is GGX, Fong, and Ward.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's like, it's a reflection and then it gets blurry and that's pretty much it. So the only one I feel looks a little bit different is the GGX. It feels like it's a little bit more glowy. But in most cases I just stick to Beckmann. It's kind of like the default thing and it renders slightly quicker. So I usually go with Beckmann. Then we have different ways that the reflection can be added on top. By default, it is set to average. Average is kind of like a normal blending mode. Up here, we can see with how much opacity the light is, the reflection is added on top of the material. So right now, we are essentially getting a mirror. Here, it looks like it's regular, but when I hit the render button, I will see how everything here becomes the same color as my light, as my sky, because it's reflecting the sky completely. So just because it shows me something here doesn't mean that it's correct. So average means it's like a mirror. I can decrease the amount that it should reflect, but yeah, not quite what I was looking for. Next, we have additive. So these are usually the two things that we switch between, either average or additive. Additive just adds whatever it sees on top. So here, when I hit the render button, I can see that it in the background starts to reflect this element and will add it on top of itself. If I also want to see the lights in the reflection, I need to make sure that they are actually seen by reflection. For that, I will go into my lights, into the visibility. I still feel like there's something missing. I don't know. And down here, oh sorry, it's in the details. Down here, we have the option to show in reflection. When we now render, we should see, ta-da, how we have these lights and they are now shown in the reflection. Now obviously we don't want it to be that sharp, we want it to be actually fairly blurry. So we will go into the roughness and increase this roughness. The higher the roughness is, the more blurry it becomes. And here I would take something fairly high, like 35, maybe even 40. When we now hit render, we can see how we now have a nice and glossy reflection on top of our elements. However, we also have a fairly strong reflection. Maybe too much, we don't want it that intense. So here we can just play around with the overall opacity of this layer, maybe to 50% or even less. Sometimes if we want the lights to be less, we could also play around with the specular strength, but usually I keep it the way it is and just play around with the overall reflection here. So let's set this to 33 and render. Oh. And maybe even more blurry. I think it looks too sharp. So let's try 45 and 25. Alright, so now we have a nice glossy reflection that's also a little bit represented on our background. We can then duplicate this over to the other layers by selecting the layer 1 here at the other materials and hitting the copy button. I can then select the next one, remove the default specular, and paste that reflection. On the green one as well, remove the default specular and paste that reflection. So when I now render this, I have some nice and stronger glossy reflections on my elements. Let's do this together. We go into, I would say, the blue material, the background material. In the reflectance channel, we will remove the default specular. We click on Add and choose Backman. Then we change the attenuation from average to additive and change the roughness to 45%. Then we decrease the opacity of that layer to about 25%. Then we can copy this by selecting layer 1, hitting copy, selecting the next material, removing the default specular, and hitting paste.
We selected layer 1.
Layer 1 and hit the copy button.
Ah, there, layer 1. Okay.
And here, default specular, remove, and paste.
Ah, you did no to all materials.
So when we now hit render, it should look like this. All right. Do you still remember how to set up the object buffers if we say we want to adjust the separate colors in Photoshop?
Yeah.
Then I would say we do that, setting up the passes so that we have the masks, and then we're done for today. All right?
What is the setting for adjusting the softbox, the size of the softbox?
On the lights, in the Details tab, size X and Y.
How come mine is grayed out?
Did you choose a different type of light? Or maybe you didn't have, let me check. All right, so I will do it first, afterwards we can do it together. Now, I want one mask for the green stuff, one mask for the purple things, one mask for the blue things in the front, and maybe one mask for the background. It's a lot of masks, but I only need to, it's actually set up quite quickly. Let me start with the green. I right-click on that layer, or that element, I go to Cinema 4D tags, and I will choose the compositing tag. Inside that one, I will go to the object buffer, and I will give this object buffer 1. Select this, just me doing.
Yeah, I know, but
Right-click, Cinema 4D tags, and then compositing, switching to the object buffer tab, and choosing this as object buffer 1. Then I can just duplicate this tag. So hold down Control and move it up. So let's say for these blue ones, I will enable object buffer 2. And I will then duplicate this over to the other blue ones, except for the background. Then I will duplicate one over for the purple one, which will then be 3, and we'll duplicate it over to the other purple ones. And then the background will then also get a duplicate, but this time it will be object buffer 4. Kind of understood? Alrighty. For the white stuff, I don't really think that I need an object buffer. And I could also make a selection of all my buffers, and then the only thing left is the white stuff. Now, in order to have this rendered out as in my PSD, I need to make sure that they are in my multipasses enabled as well. So I need to go to multipass and add a couple of object buffers. I think I cannot duplicate it here. So it would be nice if I could select it and hold down Control and duplicate it, but for some reason I'm not able to. So I really have to hit object buffer 4 times. It was 4, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. And define each one. So this would be 2, this would be 3, and this would be 4. Then, in the Save tab, I want to save out my PSD. As you might remember, in order to not have issues with different color profiles, it's also good to render out the RGBA image as the multipass. So we don't really need the regular image anymore, but I still like to have it as a reference for the before and after. I turn off the alpha channel, and for the regular image, I will save it on the desktop and call this one weekend. And this one I usually call weekend then underscore MP for multipass. Make sure that it's a multi-layer file and 16-bit. Alrighty. In the output, it's already defined to be 1000 by 1000, only to render the current frame, and that is pretty much it. The last option would be to go to the physical tab and change the sampling quality to medium, and when I then hit render, it starts to render this. But it will take quite a while. I think on my machine at home it took me about half an hour to render this.
This whole thing. Shit.
Yeah. So
I'm just doing
It'll
it.
probably take me 1 week.
So having super long render times, you need to get used to. It doesn't mean.
A render file for each of us.
Mhm.
And do it.
So just because it takes long doesn't mean necessarily that you have wrong settings. Sometimes it just really takes half an hour or even 2 hours. But usually you should try to keep your renderings kind of in a range of 30 to 45 minutes max. If it's longer than an hour, then maybe you did something wrong if the scene is not too complex. Alright, let's do these render settings together. We start with the inner text. We right-click on it, we go to Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the compositing tag. We can move the compositing tag to the right, so it's easier to copy it later on. In there, we choose the Object Buffer tab and enable the Object Buffer 1. Then we can duplicate it over to an element with a blue material. For the blue material, I want a different object buffer, so this time let's choose the Object Buffer 2. Then we can duplicate that compositing tag with the Object Buffer 2 to the other blue elements, except for the background. That one will get a separate one later on. Then we can duplicate a compositing tag to the purple material, then enable Object Buffer 3, and duplicate it to the other ones. Last but not least, we duplicate another compositing tag onto the background plane and enable Object Buffer 4. So far so good?
Yep.
Next, we need to make sure that these things are also enabled in the render settings. So we open up the render settings, go to the multipass and click on the multipass button at the bottom left, sort of. And we add the object buffer 4 times. Then we need to tell each object buffer which buffer it should be. So on the second one, we type in 2. On the third one, we type in 3. And on the fourth one, we type in 4. Then we need to define this where it should be saved. So in the save option, we click on the ... and maybe to the desktop. I'll call this one weekend. I can just copy paste this path from the regular image to the multipass image, but give it a different name, maybe _mp. Although since for the regular image we are rendering out a PNG and now we have a PSD, we don't have to rename it. We can just keep it the same name because it already has a different extension. Make sure that for the multipass, the depth is set to 16-bit and that multi-layer file is enabled. Last but not least, we want to make sure that we render out at a good quality where we don't get any grain. So we choose the physical tab and change the sampling quality from low to medium. And that's it. Now we just need to hit the render button and wait for super long for this to finish. And when it's finished, in Photoshop, we could then adjust each color separately, maybe add a little bit more contrast. So I think in this example, so the example from earlier, I think this looks nice the way it is. It's nice and soft, and we have a more realistic light setup. There, I don't think I need to touch it with Photoshop anymore. It looks fine the way it is. But for this example, we might want to increase the contrast a little bit more with Photoshop. All right. Any questions? Then this is all I had prepared for today. We're a little bit faster than I expected, which is good.
We are more slow.
No. So by now you should know how you can get things from Illustrator to Cinema, the things that you need to take care of first in order for everything to work. We now know that we can bend anything any way we want with the FFD deformer, which is kind of like a warp in Photoshop, but on steroids. And yeah, in our class next week on Saturday, I want to talk a bit more about modeling techniques. So right now we've only worked with more abstract examples or with these Illustrator things, but if we then want to have something like a turbine that we want to model or more complex things, we cannot always take primitives or things from Illustrator. Sometimes things are just more complex. And in the next class I'll show you just different techniques to create different sort of objects.
Is that the last class for this quarter?
This is the last class for this quarter.
Can you like also show us how to put objects in like real images, like it's for real? You know what I mean?
Yeah, just go to my blog.
Okay.
Oops. And oh, I don't have an internet connection. Look for the Cinema 4D class recordings, and there's, or you can also use the search function. Let me quickly look for it. No, I don't need to record this.